From the time she could walk, Joanna had been taught how to move through silence. Her steps were soft, her posture upright, her eyes never wandering too far from what was proper. In the marble corridors of Herod Antipas's palace, even a whisper could echo like thunder. Every movement mattered. Every word carried weight. She learned early that to live in the palace was to live under 1,000 eyes, some admiring, others judging, most pretending not to see. Outside, the palace shone like a jewel, walls polished, floors gleaming, servants gliding like shadows. But inside, tension coiled in the air like smoke from unseen fires. Conversations were measured, smiles rehearsed. Even laughter had a limit. Joanna's father was a respected man, a trusted official of the king. That meant she never lacked anything: fine silks, embroidered sandals, the fragrance of imported oils, meals served on plates of silver. To others, her life looked perfect, almost enviable. Yet beneath the gold and music, something inside her remained still, a silence that was not peace, but emptiness. She would sometimes stand by the tall, arched window, watching the city stir below. Merchants lifted baskets, mothers called to their children, laughter rippled through narrow streets. And though she stood draped in luxury, Joanna felt the sting of envy for a life that was free, simple, alive. In her world, even joy had to be performed. She was married young, as most noble daughters were. Her husband, Chusa, was the palace administrator, loyal, sharp-minded, a man who believed in order above all. He spoke in numbers and reports, in duties and responsibilities. And to him, Joanna was not just a wife, she was a reflection of his success. The well-dressed lady who would greet guests with grace, dine without questioning, smile without reason. Everyone said she was blessed, a woman with beauty, wealth, and a husband close to power. But inside, she felt hollow, like a vase carved from precious stone but empty of flowers. The palace was full of voices, yet none spoke to her soul. There were nights when the musicians played until dawn. The guests drank wine and danced under chandeliers. And still, Joanna would sit apart, eyes wandering beyond the lights, wondering why she could feel so lonely surrounded by people. Sometimes, she would walk through the garden alone. The fountains whispered, the roses gleamed under the moon, but none of it stirred her heart anymore. Something within her longed for more than elegance, for meaning, for purpose, for truth. But in Herod's palace, such questions were dangerous. Dreams had no place behind those gilded walls. So she hid them behind polite smiles, careful gestures, and perfect manners. To the world, she was grace embodied, but to herself, she was a prisoner draped in silk. It began quietly, a small chill on an ordinary evening. At first, Joanna brushed it aside. The palace air was often cold, the marble floors unforgiving to bare feet. But soon, the chill grew sharper. It crept into her bones, stealing her breath, wrapping her in a shiver that no blanket could warm. Within hours, her body burned with fever. Her skin glistened with sweat. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears like distant drums. Her servants panicked, rushing through corridors that had never seen such urgency. Perfumed lamps flickered as the best physicians of Herod's court were summoned, their robes heavy with herbs and oils. They came with confidence, with scrolls of knowledge, jars of ointment, and rituals whispered in old tongues. They promised recovery, they promised relief. But promise after promise, Joanna only worsened. The fever consumed her. Her lips cracked. Her breath turned shallow. The silk sheets clung to her body like damp shadows. Even her husband, Chusa, the man of numbers and reason, could no longer hide his fear. He ordered more doctors, more remedies. He spent without limit, demanding results from those who bowed before him. But with every attempt, the answers grew colder. We don't know what causes it. We can't stop it. And in those long nights, when the palace fell silent except for the sound of her trembling breath, Joanna wondered if this was how life would end, not with a cry, but with a slow fading into nothing. The same halls that once echoed with music now felt like a tomb plated in gold. The fever blurred her sight. Faces swirled around her, voices murmured in fear. And then, one voice, trembling, almost afraid to speak, whispered something different. "There is a man from Nazareth. They say he heals." Chusa frowned. His voice cut through the room, sharp and dismissive. "Charlatan, we will not disgrace this house with superstition." But even through her delirium, Joanna heard the name Jesus. It pierced through the haze like a single note of hope, and she clung to it with whatever strength remained. She begged, weakly, her lips barely forming the words, "Bring him to me." Days passed in torment, until finally, with no other option, Chusa relented. When Jesus entered the palace, there were no trumpets, no royal fanfare. He walked quietly as if heaven itself had come softly, so as not to startle the suffering. The room smelled of incense and despair. Servants stepped aside, unsure of who this man truly was. Joanna, barely conscious, felt a presence before she even saw him. And then, she did, his eyes met hers. It wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, a gaze that saw beyond fever, beyond fear, beyond the walls of the palace itself. In that look, Joanna felt seen for the first time in her life. He said nothing at first. He simply reached out his hand, and when his touch met her burning skin, it was as if time itself bowed. A breath of cool air swept through the room. The fire in her body vanished. The pain disappeared. The fever that had mocked every healer was gone as if it had never existed. Her eyes opened fully, and for the first time in days, she could see clearly. Around her, everyone gasped. The servants fell to their knees. Chusa stood frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. But Joanna, she didn't look at them. She looked only at him. Jesus smiled gently, not the smile of a man proud of power, but of one who had restored something precious. And without a word, he turned to leave. But Joanna knew her healing was only the beginning, because in that instant, something inside her had shifted. A longing that once lay dormant awoke with force. She didn't just want to live again, she wanted to follow him. From that day forward, the palace no longer felt like home. The marble floors were still polished, the music still played, but her heart was elsewhere, somewhere out on the dusty roads where the healer walked. The fever had left her body, but it had left behind a holy restlessness, the kind that could only be quieted by faith. The morning light slid through the carved windows of the palace, touching gold and marble alike. Everything looked the same servants gliding through halls, the same music echoing faintly from distant rooms. But to Joanna, it all felt different now. The air was too still, the colors too dull, the laughter too hollow. Since the day Jesus touched her, she had been walking through a life that no longer fit. She sat at her usual place beside Chusa, listening to him speak of the king's affairs, shipments, taxes, reports. His words floated around her like smoke, meaningless, fading. She nodded politely, her hands still, her mind far away. At night, she would look at her reflection in the mirror, her hair perfectly arranged, her jewelry glimmering in candlelight. But behind the beauty, she saw someone else now, someone who had been touched by eternity, yet remained trapped behind walls built by comfort. The days stretched on, each one heavier than the last. The feasts, once dazzling, now tasted of dust. The conversations, once flattering, now sounded empty. Every laugh, every polite bow, felt like an echo of a world she had already left in her heart. Sometimes, she would wander through the gardens where fountains sang and petals glowed. And in the quiet, she could almost hear his voice again, not in sound, but in memory. That gentle strength, that peace that had flowed through her veins the moment his hand touched her. It was calling her still. She tried to ignore it. She told herself it was impossible. She was a woman of status, a wife of the king's steward. The streets where Jesus walked were filled with fishermen, beggars, and outcasts. How could she belong there? Yet the more she resisted, the stronger the pull became. Chusa noticed her distance. He tried to reason with her, to bring her back to what he called reality. You're healed, Joana. Be thankful. Yes, but life must go on. You belong here. This feeling will pass. But Joana knew it wouldn't. It wasn't a passing feeling, it was a calling. One night, unable to sleep, she rose quietly from her bed. The palace was silent. Moonlight traced silver paths along the corridors. Her bare feet brushed against cold stone as she walked past the rooms of servants and guards, through halls she had known since childhood. She stopped before the great doors that opened to the courtyard. There, she hesitated. Everything she had ever known lay behind her: wealth, comfort, safety. Beyond those doors lay uncertainty, dust, and danger. But somewhere out there was the man who had given her life again. She whispered a prayer, not a grand, rehearsed prayer from the palace priests, but a trembling, honest whisper. Lord, if you call me, I will go. And in the quiet, she felt it: not words, not thunder, just peace. The kind of peace that demands movement. At dawn, she gathered a few belongings, a cloak, some coins, nothing more. The servants stared, whispering behind their hands. Chusa pleaded, his voice breaking between confusion and anger. You would leave all this for him? She looked at him gently. I was dying here, Chusa. He gave me back my life. I can't stay where my soul cannot breathe. And then she stepped out. No procession, no farewell banquet, only the sound of her sandals meeting the dust of the road. As the palace faded behind her, Joana didn't look back. The air outside smelled of earth and bread baking in the distance. She walked toward the light that grew brighter with every step. Her silk robes gathered dust. Her jewels lost their shine. But for the first time, she felt alive. Because this was not just leaving, it was awakening. She had exchanged the illusion of power for the reality of grace. And though she didn't know where the road would lead, she knew who walked it before her. The road was nothing like the marble floors Joana once knew. It was uneven, scattered with stones and dust, winding through the hills of Galilee where the air smelled of wheat and salt. The first time her sandals sank into the dirt, she almost laughed. The woman who once dined beneath chandeliers was now walking beneath an open sky. At first, her body resisted her steps, unsure, her skin unaccustomed to the Sunday. But her heart felt free. Each day, she walked a little further from who she had been, and closer to the one she now followed. Around her, the group was unlike any she'd ever known. Fishermen with rough hands and louder voices than any nobleman. Women with stories marked by pain, Mary Magdalene among them, once tormented but now radiant with peace. Mothers carrying infants, men with weathered faces, the poor, the sick, the once forgotten. And yet, among them, Joana found what had always been missing in the palace: authenticity. They laughed loudly, cried without shame, prayed with eyes lifted toward heaven rather than toward approval. They shared bread without keeping count, water without measure. Each act, each word, was unpolished but real. Joana, who had once measured every gesture to please the court, learned now to let her heart speak freely. At night, they gathered around small fires. The stars stretched endlessly above them, bright and unbothered by the world's empires. Jesus would sit among them, not like a king above his subjects, but like a shepherd among his flock. He spoke simply stories about seeds and storms, lost sheep and hidden treasures. And yet, in those words, Joana heard more wisdom than in all the scrolls of Herod's philosophers. She watched him, how he listened to the broken, how he touched the unclean without hesitation, how he smiled at children as if they were royalty. He carried no coin, no crown, no guards, and yet, wherever he went, the air seemed to shift, hope seemed to breathe again. One afternoon, after a long day of walking, Joana knelt beside Mary Magdalene to help prepare food for the group. The baskets were light, the bread few, but Jesus blessed it, broke it, and somehow there was enough. Joanna looked down at the bread in her hands, remembering the abundance of the palace, so much wasted, so little shared. Here, there was less, but somehow it was enough for everyone. Over time, she found her place among them. She did what she had always done best. She organized, cared, provided. When they needed food, she found it. When someone fell ill, she stayed beside them, recalling the compassion that once healed her. She used her resources quietly, never to be seen, never to be praised. In those simple tasks, she discovered a kind of joy that had no counterpart in the palace. There, she had been served. Here, she served. There, she had been admired. Here, she was known. And in that knowing, she felt the pulse of true nobility, the kind that comes not from birth, but from love. Still, not everyone approved. Rumors began to travel back to the court. Servants whispered, "Cusa's wife walks with fishermen now. She eats with beggars." Some called her mad, others pitied her. But Joanna no longer cared. Her worth was no longer defined by titles or whispers. She walked with the Messiah, the only king she needed to follow. Yet she noticed something else too. Even within the group, there were glances of curiosity, sometimes doubt. What is a woman like her doing here? But Joanna did not defend herself. She simply worked, smiled, and listened. Her faith spoke more clearly than her words ever could. And whenever she caught Jesus' eyes, that same gaze that once burned through her fever, she knew he understood. He saw the cost of her choice, the courage it required to leave everything behind. And in that knowing, she found peace again. One evening, as the group camped by the sea, the sound of waves filled the air. Joanna sat watching the water reflect the last light of day. She thought of the palace, of the marble corridors and endless noise. Then she looked around at the tired faces glowing in the firelight, at Jesus speaking softly to a child, and she realized she was finally home. That morning, the sky seemed darker than it should have been. The city of Jerusalem stirred in uneasy silence. Merchants whispered, soldiers marched with grim faces, and people gathered as if drawn by something terrible and sacred. Joanna walked among them, her cloak pulled tight, her steps slow, her heart heavy. The air itself felt strange, thick with sorrow. She had followed him for so long through dusty roads, through laughter, through miracles, and now she followed again. But this time, to the hill of death. The shouts came first, sharp, angry, echoing between the stone walls. Then the sound of wood dragging along the ground. When Joanna finally saw him, her breath caught. Jesus beaten, bloodied. The crown of thorns pressed cruelly upon his head was carrying the cross. Each step was agony, yet his eyes remained calm, almost tender. The crowd jeered, some wept, others turned away. Joanna could not move. Her legs trembled, but her gaze stayed fixed on him. She remembered his hand on her burning skin, the moment he had lifted her from the edge of death. And now, she watched the very hands that healed her being nailed to rough wood. The hammer struck. Once, twice. Each sound tore through her chest like lightning. She could not scream, her voice was gone. Tears streamed silently down her face as the cross was raised. The sun hung high, yet the world grew dim. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no storm gathered. Around her, the women wept. Mary Magdalene, the mother of Jesus, Salome, each broken in her own way. Joanna reached for their hands, clinging to them as if to steady her soul. She wanted to run to him, to pull the nails out, to beg the world to stop. But all she could do was stand beneath that cross, a silent witness to love, stretched out and bleeding. And even in that horror, something in his presence still whispered peace. No rage, no revenge, only love, fierce, forgiving, unstoppable. When he cried out, "It is finished," the earth itself trembled. Joanna fell to her knees. Then came the silence. The kind of silence that feels like the end of everything. The crowd dispersed. The soldiers left, and the hill of death was empty again except for a few women and the sound of wind moving through the crosses. That night was long, the next day even longer. Saturday hung like a heavy shroud, no words, no songs, only grief. Joana could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the thorns, the blood, the compassion in his dying eyes. She wondered if this was the end of the story. And yet, deep within her, something still whispered, wait. At dawn on the third day, she rose. The sky was still pale, the air cold. She gathered the spices and linen with trembling hands, the final act of love for the one who had changed her life. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, joined her. The road to the tomb was silent, each step a prayer. When they arrived, Joana stopped. The stone, that great, heavy stone, was no longer there. It was rolled aside. Her heart raced. She looked inside and gasped. The tomb was empty. No body, no trace, only folded linen and a silence too powerful to understand. Then a voice, bright, clear, almost like music. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Joana turned and saw them, two men in radiant light, faces shining with eternity. The world seemed to spin. The impossible had happened. She fell to her knees, tears of awe spilling onto the earth. Every fear, every doubt, every night of silence was shattered in that moment. He had conquered death. Without thinking, she ran. Her feet pounded against the road, her breath sharp in the morning air. She had to tell them, the others, the ones hiding in fear. He is alive, she cried when she reached the disciples. I saw the tomb, it's empty. But instead of joy, she was met with silence, disbelief. Some turned away, others shook their heads. Still, Joana's eyes burned with conviction. She didn't need anyone to believe her to know the truth. She had seen it, and in that moment, her faith became more than a choice. It became a fire, quiet, steady, unstoppable. After the resurrection, everything changed, not only in Jerusalem, but inside Joana herself. The one she had followed, the one she had seen die and rise again, had become her compass. Fear no longer ruled her steps. She walked with a quiet certainty that life, even under the shadow of persecution, was no longer the same kind of life she had once known. The disciples scattered, their names whispered in secret. Meetings moved into hidden rooms. Prayers were spoken in hushed tones, and faith became dangerous. But Joana did not hide. She had walked through palaces and through crosses. What was left to fear? They said she opened her home to believers when others were too afraid. That she shared what she had with those who fled the guards, that her table was never empty, even when resources were scarce. She became, in many ways, the silent strength behind the early church, a presence both gentle and immovable. Those who knew her said she had a gift for peace. In moments of panic, her calm voice could still the room. When someone doubted, she would simply smile and say, I saw him. He lives. No argument, no debate, just truth spoken with quiet conviction. Years passed, and her name slowly faded from the public eye. History rarely honors those who serve in silence, but among the believers, her story remained alive. They would whisper in the dim light of oil lamps. She was there, from the beginning to the end. Some said she helped record the memories that later became the Gospels, that her precise recollection of Jesus' words and expressions gave shape to the stories that would outlive empires. And perhaps that's true, because when she spoke of him, people listened not because she was eloquent, but because her eyes carried something eternal. Joana had known two worlds, the world of power and the world of faith. She understood both the politics of men and the kingdom of heaven. She became a bridge between the two, unassuming, unseen, but essential. There were times when old acquaintances from the palace crossed her path again. They would lower their voices, glancing around before speaking. Joana, is it true? Did he really rise? And she would look at them with that same gentle certainty, the kind that came from experience rather than rumor. Yes, she would say. I was there. No persuasion, no pride, just truth. As the years wore on, her hair turned silver, Her body weakened, but her spirit remained fierce. She still gathered with believers in small hidden houses, still prayed for the fearful, comforted the widows, and guided the young. When she could no longer travel, they came to her leaders, seekers, doubters, and she would tell them stories of the days when the Messiah walked dusty roads, of laughter by the firelight, of the sound of his voice calming storms, of the moment the tomb was empty. Children loved to sit near her, resting their heads on her lap as she spoke. Her hands, once adorned with jewels, were now lined with years of service, but they still moved gracefully, as if every motion carried a blessing. Her life ended as she lived it quietly, without spectacle, surrounded by those she had loved and served. There were no grand monuments, no songs written in her name, only tears of gratitude and the echo of a faith that refused to die. They said that on the night she passed, the small gathering of believers lit candles in her honor, not as a ritual, but as remembrance. Because to them, Joanna had been a light, not bright and blinding, but steady and faithful. A flame that refused to go out, even when the winds of persecution tried to snuff it out. Her name appears only twice in the Gospels, a passing mention in the world's eyes, but in heaven's story, it was more than enough. Because she had done what few dared to do. She traded privilege for purpose, comfort for calling, safety for the Savior. And though centuries would pass, her life would continue to whisper to those who seek meaning beyond titles and riches. That faith is not loud. Faith is not proud. Faith is quiet obedience, the kind that walks through fear, loss, and uncertainty, and still says, "I will follow." And so, the woman who once walked through Herod's marble halls ended her days walking through streets of stone with the poor and the broken, her feet dusty, her heart radiant, her gaze forever lifted toward heaven. Her story remains not in history books, but in hearts. Because Joanna's faith did not end with her life. It lives in every soul who dares to step out of comfort and follow the call of the one who heals, redeems, and restores.
Little one is like these stars, small perhaps, but look to the lamps, children. Though the night is long, the smallest flame can guide us through the darkness.